Mice can smell a single drop of peppermint oil from 6 feet away, and it is enough to send them running from a house they have lived in for months. I have watched 3 generations of my family clear barns, cottages, and grain stores of mice using nothing more than what sits in an ordinary kitchen cupboard. My name does not matter so much as what I was taught, but I grew up in the Yorkshire Dales, in a stone farmhouse that had stood since before my grandfather's grandfather was born. He was the one who taught me most of what I know, standing beside me in a cold granary with a mortar and pestle, showing me how to grind spice until the air itself stung your nose. These were not stories told for entertainment. They were daily practice, the kind of knowledge a family needed simply to keep their food stores intact through a long English winter. I watched these methods work with my own eyes, season after season. Long before anyone thought to question whether they were effective, I share them now because fewer and fewer people still know them, and that is a loss worth putting right. Somewhere along the way, the simple methods our grandparents relied on were quietly pushed aside. Pest control became an industry with plastic traps, chemical beds, and subscription services that promised to solve a problem that our ancestors solved for free with what was already in the larder. There was very little incentive for companies selling poison and plastic to remind anyone that a few pantry spices, properly prepared, could do the same job without the expense or the risk. So the knowledge simply faded from common use, not because it stopped working, but because nobody was left to profit from teaching it. What you are about to hear is not a theory dreamed up for a video. These are methods tested across hundreds of winters by families who had no pest control company to call and no money to spare, even if they had. They worked then in cold stone farmhouses with grain stores to protect, and they still work now in modern homes with the very same species of mouse behind the skirting board. Mice navigate almost entirely by scent. A house mouse has an olfactory system many times more sensitive than a human's, and it relies on smell not just to find food, but to judge whether an area is safe to nest in. In the wild, a mouse reads scent the way we read a room, picking up signals of danger, competition, and food long before it ever sees anything with its eyes. This is precisely why our ancestors never bothered with poison when a strong enough scent could simply convince a mouse the territory was not worth staying in. My grandfather always said, "You do not need to kill a mouse to be rid of it. You only need to make it believe it has already lost the argument." That belief is the entire foundation of what I am about to walk you through. Cinnamon was one of the very first defenses used in English grain stores, going back long before refrigeration or modern packaging existed. Merchants shipping goods by sea in wooden crates learned early that cinnamon bark, when broken and left among stored grain, discouraged rodents from nesting inside the cargo. The reason lies in a compound called cinnamaldehyd, the very oil that gives cinnamon its familiar warm smell, which is mild and pleasant to us, but sharp and overwhelming to a mouse's far more sensitive nose. Whole cinnamon sticks release very little of this oil on their own, which is why grinding is essential rather than optional. When you crush or grind cinnamon, you rupture the surface of the bark and expose the volatile oils that were previously sealed inside, releasing a scent far stronger than the whole stick could ever produce sitting quietly in a cupboard. During rationing in the 1940s, when commercial rodent control was scarce and every pound of stored food mattered, many rural households leaned on ground cinnamon mixed into cloth pouches and placed exactly where mice were known to travel. It was not glamorous work, but it kept the flour tins and the oat bins untouched through winters, when nothing could be wasted. Cayenne pepper does something rather different to cinnamon, and that difference is exactly why we use them together rather than alone. Cayenne contains a compound called capsaicin, the very same compound that makes chili peppers burn on the tongue. A mouse does not taste capsaicin the way we do, but its nasal passages and whiskers are extremely sensitive to airborne particles, and fine cayenne dust irritates those passages the moment a mouse gets close enough to investigate. This is not about pain in the way a trap causes pain. It is about discomfort strong enough that a mouse learns almost immediately that a particular root or corner of the house is simply not worth crossing again. Older Yorkshire farmhouses often kept a tin of ground pepper by the pantry door. For exactly this reason, dusted lightly along skirting boards where mice were known to run at night. It was considered such ordinary knowledge that nobody thought to write it down, which is part of why so much of it has quietly disappeared from memory. Freshly ground cayenne matters here just as much as freshly ground cinnamon. because the sharper compounds that irritate a mouse's senses begin to weaken the moment the pepper is exposed to air. A jar of pepper that has sat open on a shelf for a year will do far less work than pepper ground the same day you intend to use it. Peppermint is, without question, the oldest and most trusted rodent deterrent in English domestic history. Victorian households grew peppermint specifically for this purpose, planting it near doorways, larders, and outbuildings where mice were known to enter. The oil inside a peppermint leaf contains menthol, a compound so intensely sharp to a rodent's senses that it effectively overwhelms their ability to smell anything else nearby, including the food they came looking for in the first place. Dried and crushed peppermint leaves, or a few drops of true peppermint oil worked into a dry mixture, multiply this effect considerably beyond what the plant alone can offer. But that is only the first part of what I want to share with you today, because peppermint on its own, without the other two, tends to fade in strength faster than most people expect. The real power of this method comes from compounding all three together, which is where most people are genuinely surprised by how effective a simple kitchen mixture can be. Cinnamon, cayenne, and peppermint each irritate a slightly different part of a mouse's sensory system, and when combined, they create what is best described as a wall of discomfort that a mouse cannot simply adjust to over time. A mouse can, given enough exposure, grow somewhat used to a single scent if it remains constant and unchanging. It cannot easily adjust to three overlapping, competing signals firing at once, each one distinct, each one demanding attention from a nervous system built entirely around interpreting smell. This is precisely why chemical traps so often fail after a few weeks, while a properly compounded spice barrier tends to hold its effectiveness far longer, provided it is refreshed on a reasonable schedule. Grinding these three ingredients together is not something to rush, and how you do it changes the outcome considerably. Whole cinnamon sticks, whole dried chilies if you have them, and dried peppermint leaves should be ground together rather than combining pre-ground powders from a shop shelf, because whole ingredients hold their volatile oils far longer before use. A simple mortar and pestle does this job perfectly well, and there is something rather fitting about using the same basic tool my grandfather used decades ago. Grind until the mixture becomes a fine, slightly oily powder. Fine enough that it releases scent into the air the moment it is disturbed, rather than sitting inert as coarse fragments. The finer the grind, the more surface area is exposed, and the more volatile oil escapes into the surrounding air where a mouse will actually encounter it. A rough guide that has served my family well is 2 parts ground cinnamon, 1 part ground cayenne, and 1 part crushed dried peppermint, though exact proportions matter less than making certain the mixture is fresh and finely ground. Keep watching, because what comes next is the most important step of all, and it is the step most people skip entirely when they try this on their own. None of this works if it is simply left in a bowl on the kitchen counter, because scent alone does not travel through a house the way people assume it does. Mice move along very specific, repeated routes, almost always following walls, skirting, boards, and the edges of rooms, rather than crossing open floor space where they feel exposed. The most effective placement is directly along these travel routes, not scattered randomly through a room hoping for the best. Small cloth pouches, the kind easily made from an old handkerchief or a scrap of muslin, allow the powder to release scent steadily over days without spilling loose across your floors and furniture. Fill each pouch loosely, tie it closed, and place these pouches along skirting boards, inside cupboards where mice have been active, and especially near any gap where you suspect they are entering the house. Door frames, the base of exterior walls, and the area beneath kitchen cabinets are the most common entry corridors in older English homes. And they are exactly where these pouches do the most good. For areas where loose powder is more practical than a pouch, such as along a skirting board in a rarely used room, a light dusting worked into the corner where wall meets floor achieves much the same result. Refreshing this mixture matters a great deal, and it is where many people quietly undermine their own efforts without realizing it. The volatile oils that make this method effective begin weakening within a week to 10 days, even when the powder itself still looks and smells fine to a human nose. A mouse's far more sensitive senses will notice that weakening long before you do, which is why a fading barrier so often leads people to believe the method has simply stopped working. Grinding a fresh batch every 7 to 10 days and rotating pouches out as they lose potency keeps the barrier consistently strong enough to matter. My grandfather kept a small tin specifically for this purpose, refreshed every Sunday evening without fail, the same way some families might change the water in a vase of flowers. It became simply part of the rhythm of keeping a home, not a chore to dread, but a small, quiet habit. This spice barrier works best when it is not asked to do the entire job on its own, and that is worth being honest about. Mice are, above all else, opportunists, and even the strongest scent barrier will eventually be tested if there remains an easy entry point into the house. Walking the outside perimeter of a home and sealing any gap wider than a pencil, particularly around pipework, vents, and the base of doors, removes the opportunity that scent alone cannot always prevent. Steel wool packed tightly into small gaps works remarkably well for this, because mice are unable to gnaw through it the way they can chew straight through plaster, wood, or plastic filler. Combined with the spice barrier along interior roots, sealing these entry points from the outside turns a temporary deterrent into a home mice genuinely stop trying to enter at all. There is also a seasonal rhythm worth understanding, one that our ancestors paid very close attention to even without knowing the science behind it. Mice seek shelter indoors most aggressively as autumn temperatures begin to drop, searching for warmth and a steady food source before winter fully arrives. This is precisely the window when a spice barrier does its most important work, discouraging mice before they have had the chance to settle in and establish a nest, renewing your pouches, and refreshing your grind in early autumn rather than waiting until you notice droppings or hear scratching in the walls. Keeps you ahead of the problem rather than reacting to it after the fact. By the time deep winter arrives, a home that has kept this barrier fresh through autumn is far less likely to have any uninvited guests at all. I have thought a good deal over the years about why a method this simple and this effective was allowed to fade from common memory. Part of it, I think, is that convenience became more valued than understanding, and a box bought from a shop felt easier than grinding spice by hand on a Sunday evening. But convenience is not the same thing as effectiveness, and I have seen far too many chemical traps sit untouched in a corner, while the mice carried on exactly as before. What was lost was not the knowledge itself, so much as the patience to use it properly, the willingness to grind fresh, to refresh a pouch, to walk the perimeter of your own home and pay attention to it. None of that requires money, and none of it requires waiting for anyone else to solve the problem for you. It only requires doing what families in these hills did for generations. Using what was already in the pantry and trusting that it still works, because it does. If this has been useful to you, there are more methods where this one came from. I share a new one every day, drawn from the same well of practical knowledge that kept homes fed warm and free of pests long before anyone thought to sell a solution for a problem that never needed solving in the first place. The old ways are still here. You simply have to know where to look.